The royal kitchen had exactly 3 rules. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't touch the Alpha King's private dining set. And never, under any circumstances, cook for the king unless you had been formally appointed, trained, certified, and approved by the royal head chef himself, a terrifying man named Edmund, who once made a sous chef cry by simply looking at his hollandaise sauce. Joni Francis had broken all 3 rules before noon. And the worst part? She didn't even do it on purpose. Well, the first 2 were accidents. The third one, the cooking, that one was a dare. Specifically, it was a dare issued by Carla Washburn, the most senior kitchen maid in the entire palace, who had looked Joni dead in the eyes over a pot of boiling stock and said, with the casual confidence of someone who had absolutely nothing to lose, "I dare you to cook something, and leave it on the Alpha King's private dining tray. 10 silver coins if you do it, 20 if he actually eats it." Joni should have said no. She always should have said no. That was her whole problem. Instead, she said, "What does he like?" And that single, catastrophic question was how Joni Francis, age 23, junior kitchen maid, daughter of a farmer, owner of exactly 1 good dress and 0 survival instincts, ended up standing in the middle of the Alpha King's private dining hall at 11:30 in the morning, watching the most powerful and feared werewolf in 7 kingdoms lift a spoonful of her slow-braised lamb stew to his lips and close his eyes. The room was absolutely silent. His royal advisor, a pale man named Albert Parks, had stopped breathing entirely. The 2 royal guards by the door had their hands on their weapons. And Joni was hidden behind a pillar, both hands pressed over her mouth, watching through one eye because she physically could not open the other one. The Alpha King set down his spoon. He looked at the tray. He looked at Albert. And in a voice so quiet it could have meant anything, fury, confusion, something far more dangerous than either, he said, "Who made this?" Albert Parks opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. And Joni Francis made the worst decision of her entire life. She stepped out from behind the pillar. But before we continue, Joni couldn't say no to a dare. You can't say no to a good story. We're all the same here. Like the video and let's continue. Chapter 1. Joni Francis had a gift. Not the useful kind. Not healing or prophecy, or the ability to sense danger before it arrived. No, Joni's gift was far more inconvenient than any of those. Joni Francis could not say no. Not to anyone, not about anything. Not even when every rational part of her brain was screaming at her to close her mouth, shake her head, and walk in the opposite direction as fast as her legs would carry her. It had started young, back on her father's farm in the outer territories of Valdenmoor, where the soil was red clay and the winters lasted 6 months, and everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew their own. Joni was the youngest of 4 children, the only girl, and by some cruel twist of family dynamics, she had become the one everyone turned to when they needed something done and didn't want to do it themselves. "Joni, will you mend this fence? Joni, can you cover my shift at the mill? Joni, I need you to tell Father what I broke." And every single time, without fail, Joni had looked at whoever was asking, felt that horrible pull in her chest, that desperate, bone-deep need to be useful, to be needed, to not be the one who let someone down, and she had said yes. Always yes. When she was 16, she'd said yes to helping her neighbor plant an entire field in a single afternoon, and pulled a muscle in her back that troubled her for 2 years. When she was 19, she'd said yes to a friend who needed someone to take the palace entrance examination in her place, which was both illegal and terrifying, and somehow passed, which was how she ended up here, in the royal kitchens of Valdenmoor Palace, wearing a gray uniform 2 sizes too big, and peeling potatoes for a living. She didn't resent it. That was the strangest part. The palace was the most remarkable place she'd ever been, vast and cold and glittering, full of marble corridors and silver sconces, and the constant low hum of power that lived in the walls themselves. The kitchen was warm, the work was honest, and Joni was genuinely, quietly good at cooking, better than she was at most things, better than she would ever admit out loud. Edmund, the head chef, had noticed within her first month. He hadn't said anything kind about it, naturally. Edmund communicated exclusively through criticism and ominous silence, but he had started assigning her to the more complex prep work, the stalks and the braises, and the slow things that required patience and instinct rather than just speed. It was the closest thing to a compliment she was likely to get, and she'd treasured it. She had been here 4 years now. 4 years of yes. 4 years of covering other people's shifts and taking on extra tasks and never, not once, pushing back when someone put something in her hands and said, "Handle this." Which was precisely why, on the morning of the autumn court gathering, when every noble family in the 7 kingdoms had sent representatives to the palace, and the kitchens were operating at approximately 300% capacity, and everyone was slightly hysterical, Carla Washburn had looked at Joni over that pot of boiling stock, and issued her dare with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly which lever to pull. "I dare you to cook something, and leave it on the Alpha King's private dining tray." Joni had known it was a terrible idea. She had known it the way you know a storm is coming. That particular shift in the air, the way the light changes, the animal instinct at the base of your skull that whispers, "Go inside." She had said yes anyway. "It doesn't have to be fancy," Carla had added helpfully, already reaching into her apron for the 10 silver coins she was clearly confident she wouldn't have to pay. "He barely eats anyway. Edmund says half his trays come back untouched. You could make literally anything." That was the detail that undid her completely. He barely eats. Joni didn't know anything about the Alpha King. Not really. His name was Harold Hess. He had ruled Valdenmoor for 11 years, since he was 22, after his father died under circumstances that nobody in the kitchen ever discussed above a whisper. He was described, variously, as terrifying, brilliant, ruthless, and cold. The maids who cleaned his private chambers reported that he owned exactly 0 personal decorations. No portraits, no mementos, nothing soft. Just weapons on the walls and books on the shelves, and a fireplace that was always lit because apparently even the most feared alpha in 7 kingdoms felt the cold. She didn't know why that detail about the untouched trays burrowed under her skin the way it did. She just knew that the idea of someone, anyone, not eating, made something in her chest tighten uncomfortably. So she'd made the lamb stew. Slow-braised, the way her mother had taught her, with root vegetables and a dark stock she'd been tending for 2 days, and a handful of dried herbs from the kitchen garden, that she'd crumbled between her fingers until the whole prep station smelled like autumn. She'd done it quietly, in the 40-minute window between the breakfast service and the start of lunch prep, while Edmund was upstairs arguing with the royal steward about the centerpiece situation. She'd plated it simply. No garnish. She wasn't trying to show off. She was trying not to get caught. A clean bowl, a cloth napkin, a spoon aligned properly because she'd been raised to do things properly even when she was doing them wrong. She'd carried it to the private dining hall herself because she couldn't ask anyone else to do it without involving them in her crime. She'd set it on the table and she'd meant to leave. She had genuinely, sincerely meant to leave. But then she'd heard footsteps in the corridor, that specific, measured cadence that made every person in the palace unconsciously straighten their spine, and she'd done the only thing available to her. She'd hidden behind the pillar. And she'd watched Harold Hess, Alpha King of Valdenmoor, sit down at his private dining table, look at the unfamiliar tray with an expression she couldn't read from this distance, and, after a long, suspicious pause, pick up the spoon. The moment he closed his eyes, something happened in Joni's chest that she had absolutely no framework for. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was something quieter and more frightening than pride. It was the feeling of having given someone something they needed without them having to ask. She'd never felt it quite like this before. And then he'd opened his eyes and said, "Who made this?" In that voice, low and precise, and carrying the particular weight of someone who always received answers to their questions. And Albert Parks had gone white, and the guards had tensed, and Joni's brain had said, "Do not move, do not breathe, do not," and her legs had walked her out from behind the pillar. She stood in the middle of the Alpha King's private dining hall. Harold Hess turned in his chair and looked at her. He was larger than she'd expected, not that she'd let herself think about it, with dark eyes that were currently doing something complicated that she couldn't interpret. Not angry, not yet. Something more like, assessing, the way you look at something unexpected and haven't yet decided what category to put it in. Joni's mouth opened. The professional, sensible thing to say was, "I apologize for the intrusion, Your Majesty. It will not happen again." What came out instead was, "The stock needed another hour, but I didn't have another hour, so I added a reduction at the end to compensate. I think it held. Did it hold?" Complete silence. Albert Parks made a sound like a man watching a cart roll toward a cliff. Harold Hess looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he looked back at the bowl. "Sit down," he said. Chapter 2. Harold Hess had not always been this way. There was a version of him, younger, less careful, not yet hollowed out by 11 years of ruling a kingdom that tested him every single day, who had loved meals. Not just the food itself, though food had mattered too. It was the ritual of it, the way a properly set table signaled that someone had thought about you before you arrived, the warmth of a kitchen, the particular comfort of sitting down and allowing yourself, for 30 unguarded minutes, to simply be a person who was hungry and was being fed. His mother had been the one who taught him that. She'd been a remarkable woman, fierce and warm in equal measure, the kind of person who made every room feel smaller and safer just by being in it. She had insisted, against every advisor's recommendation, that the royal family eat together every evening, no formal dining, no court ceremony, just the family, a table, food she'd often helped prepare herself, because she said it tasted different when someone made it with intention. Harold had been 12 when she died. He'd been 22 when his father followed, and the crown had settled on his head like a stone, and he'd looked around the vast, echoing palace and understood for the first time what alone actually meant. The meals had changed after that. Not immediately. There had been a period, in the first year of his reign, when he'd still tried, had sat at the long formal dining table in the stateroom and watched the servants bring course after course of perfectly prepared, impeccably presented food, and felt nothing. No hunger, no comfort, just the hollow mechanics of consumption, fuel for a body that had work to do. He'd moved to the private dining hall in his second year. Smaller, quieter. Albert had suggested it might help, less ceremonial, more personal. It hadn't helped. The food was still perfect and still tasted like nothing in particular, and the trays came and went, and sometimes he ate and sometimes he didn't, and nobody said anything, because he was the Alpha King, and nobody said anything to him about anything, unless they wanted to spend an uncomfortable amount of time explaining their reasoning. Edmund sent increasingly elaborate meals, which Harold understood as the head chef's version of concern, and appreciated without being able to reciprocate it. He'd stopped thinking about it, eventually. Food was fuel. Fuel kept him functional. He ate enough to maintain his strength, and that was the end of the consideration he gave it. This morning had started like every other morning during the autumn court gathering, which was to say, badly. He'd been in meetings since before dawn. 3 territorial disputes, 1 diplomatic complaint from the Eastern Ridge delegation that required delicate handling, and a 40-minute argument with his own council about grain allocation that had resolved nothing and irritated everyone. By the time Albert had quietly indicated it was past 11 and he hadn't eaten since the previous evening, Harold had felt the particular exhaustion that lived behind his eyes and nowhere else, the kind that sleep didn't fix because it wasn't tiredness. It was something deeper and less nameable. He'd gone to the private dining hall because it was the only room in the palace where nobody followed him without invitation. The tray was already there. That was the first unusual thing. His meals were never early. Edmund ran a precise kitchen on a precise schedule, and the midday tray arrived at noon, not 11:30. The second unusual thing was the smell. Harold had excellent senses. All werewolves did, but his were alpha sharp, tuned over years to detect threat and deception, and the particular chemical signatures of human emotion. He used them constantly, automatically, in every meeting and every conversation. He did not, generally, use them in relation to food, but the smell that met him when he entered the private dining hall was so immediately, unexpectedly arresting that he stopped walking before he'd consciously decided to. It was lamb. Slow-cooked, deeply savory, layered with something herbal and something sweet, and underneath both of those things a richness that suggested someone had been tending that stock for a very long time. It smelled like... He didn't finish the thought. He sat down. He looked at the bowl. It was plated simply. No elaborate presentation, no garnish, just a clean white bowl and a cloth napkin, and a spoon positioned with the unconscious precision of someone who'd been taught to do things properly. There was something almost private about its simplicity, like it hadn't been made to impress anyone, like it had just been made. He picked up the spoon. The first taste hit him somewhere completely unexpected. It wasn't just that it was good, though it was, genuinely and remarkably good, the kind of cooking that couldn't be faked or technically replicated, because it required something beyond skill. It was that it was warm, not in temperature, in quality. It tasted like something made by someone who had been thinking about the person who would eat it, who had wanted them to feel something specific, cared for maybe, settled. Harold Hess closed his eyes. He sat in the quiet of his private dining hall and felt, for the first time in longer than he could accurately calculate, the uncomplicated comfort of being fed. Then he opened his eyes and said, "Who made this?" He'd half expected silence, or stammering, or the immediate appearance of Edmund, red-faced and apologetic, with an explanation involving kitchen errors and unauthorized use of his private tray service. What he had not expected was the girl. She came out from behind the pillar to his left. He'd known she was there, of course, had clocked her presence the moment he sat down and filed it under deal with this in a moment. And she stood in the middle of his dining hall, in a gray kitchen uniform that was slightly too large for her, and she looked at him with dark eyes that were doing something remarkable. They weren't afraid. Concerned, yes, visibly aware that she had done something she probably shouldn't have done, but not afraid. Not the particular freeze response he'd long since grown tired of seeing in people who found themselves unexpectedly in his presence. She was looking at him the way you look at something you made that you're genuinely uncertain about, like the outcome still mattered to her independent of any consequence to herself. And then she'd said, not an apology, not an explanation, but a question, something about the stock and a reduction, and did it hold? And Harold had felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. It felt, absurdly, like being seen. Not the king, not the alpha, not the title or the power, or the carefully constructed exterior that kept 7 kingdoms in respectful order. Just the bowl, the person who would eat from it, whether it was right. "Sit down," he said. She blinked. Behind him, he heard Albert Parks make the sound of a man who had dedicated his life to protocol and was now watching it dissolve in real time. The girl, she was young, he registered, mid-20s at most, with the kind of face that showed everything it was thinking whether it intended to or not. She was currently thinking this is either the best or worst outcome, and I genuinely cannot tell which. She sat down. Not across the table. She chose the chair at the end. The smallest distance she could put between them, while still technically complying. It was such a specific, instinctive act of self-minimization that he noticed it immediately. "Your name," he said. "Joni," she said. Then, after a half-second pause, "Francis. Joni Francis. Junior kitchen maid, Your Majesty. 4th year. I know I'm not supposed to be in here, and I'm not supposed to touch your tray service, and I genuinely did not plan to still be here. I was going to leave before you." "The reduction," he said. She stopped. "What?" "You said you added a reduction to compensate for the stock. Walk me through it." Another blink, and then, and this was the thing that settled something in him that hadn't been settled in years. Her expression shifted from anxiety into something else entirely. Into genuine engagement, into the look of someone who actually wanted to talk about this. "The stock needed another 40 minutes to develop properly," she said, leaning forward slightly, without seeming to notice she was doing it. "But I was working in a stolen window. I had maybe 40 minutes total. So I pulled a cup of the stock early, and reduced it down separately, about by half, and added it back in at the end. It concentrates the depth without the time. It's not perfect," she added quickly. "A properly developed stock would have more." "It's the best thing I've eaten in 4 years, Harold said. The sentence arrived before he'd decided to say it. Joni Francis stared at him. He looked back at her steadily, because he was the Alpha King, and he did not retract statements, just because they had surprised him on the way out. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, which was itself unusual, and Harold became aware of two things simultaneously. The first was that he was still hungry, actually, genuinely hungry, in a way that had nothing to do with fuel or function. He wanted more of the stew. He wanted to sit here and finish it properly. The second thing was more complicated, and he set it aside for later examination. He looked at Albert, who was standing by the door in a state of barely contained professional crisis. "Clear my afternoon," Harold said. Albert blinked. "Your Majesty, the Eastern Ridge delegation is scheduled at—" "Reschedule it." He looked back at the bowl, then at Joni Francis, who was staring at him with an expression that suggested she was trying to calculate the fastest route to the door. "And tell Edmund I'd like Miss Francis reassigned to my private kitchen, effective immediately." The room went very quiet. Joni Francis opened her mouth. Unless, Harold said, meeting her eyes, "you'd like to say no." She closed her mouth, opened it again, and said, because of course she did. Because Joni Francis had never successfully said no to anything in her entire 23 years of living. "No. Yes. I'll do it." Harold Hess looked back at his bowl. For the first time in 4 years, he finished his meal. Chapter 3. By the time Joni made it back to the main kitchen, the news had already arrived before her. She didn't know how. She hadn't told anyone. Albert Parks had the conversational warmth of a marble statue and seemed unlikely to gossip. The 2 guards by the door hadn't moved or spoken. And yet somehow, by the time she pushed through the heavy kitchen doors at 10 minutes past noon, every person in the room was already looking at her. Carla Washburn was leaning against the prep counter with her arms folded, and an expression that existed somewhere between impressed and genuinely alarmed. "Reassigned," Carla said. "Not a question." "Reassigned," Joni confirmed. "To his private kitchen. Apparently." Carla was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her apron, produced 20 silver coins, and set them on the counter between them with the careful precision of someone laying down evidence at a trial. "I feel," Carla said slowly, "that I owe you an apology." "You owe me 40, Joni said, "because the stress alone has taken years off my life." But even as she said it, even as the familiar comfort of Carla's company settled around her like a warm coat, something was happening in Joni's chest that she couldn't quite account for. It wasn't dread, exactly. It wasn't excitement either, though she was deeply suspicious of the small, warm flicker that kept trying to be excitement and needed to be firmly discouraged. It was something more like standing at the edge of a very large change and not yet knowing if you were about to step forward or fall. The private kitchen was nothing like the main kitchen. The main kitchen was organized chaos. 40 people, 6 stations, noise and heat, and the constant controlled emergency of feeding an entire palace. It was exhausting and demanding, and Joni loved it the way you love something that's been your whole world for 4 years. The private kitchen was small, quiet, positioned directly adjacent to the Alpha King's private dining hall, separated by a single heavy door that was, she noted, currently closed. It had everything she needed, and nothing she didn't. A single large hearth, well-seasoned. A prep counter of good stone, cool and smooth. Shelves of spices and dried herbs organized with a precision that suggested someone cared about this room even if it was rarely used. A cold store through a narrow door to the left, stocked with provisions that made her cook's instincts hum with quiet interest. And, sitting on the prep counter when she arrived, a single folded piece of paper. She opened it. The handwriting was precise and slightly severe, like its owner. Miss Francis. Midday meal at noon. Evening meal at 7. Dietary restrictions. None. Preferences. Unknown. A. Parks. Joni read it twice. Then she turned it over, as if there might be additional instructions on the back. There weren't. Preferences. Unknown. She stood in the middle of the small, quiet kitchen and thought about a man who had eaten untouched trays for 4 years and apparently had no known food preferences because nobody had ever thought to ask him. That feeling moved through her chest again. She firmly put it somewhere else and started taking inventory. The first week was the strangest of her life, and she had once accidentally agreed to help her brother roof a barn in a thunderstorm, so the bar was not low. The structure was simple enough. She cooked, he ate. Albert Parks appeared occasionally to deliver logistical information, with the emotional range of a ledger book. There were no formal instructions beyond the note, no request for specific dishes, no feedback delivered through official channels, no indication of preference or opinion. Except that the trays always came back empty. Every single one. Joni was aware, in the abstract way you're aware of things you're trying not to think about too directly, that this meant something. That 4 years of untouched trays followed by a sudden and complete reversal was significant data. She just wasn't sure what she was supposed to do with it. She cooked the way she always cooked, with attention and instinct, and the particular care of someone who had learned early that feeding people was one of the few forms of love she was reliably good at. She varied the meals deliberately, testing the range of what the private stores could offer. A slow-roasted root vegetable soup on the second day, braised short ribs on the third, with something sharp and bright alongside to cut through the richness. A simple pan-seared fish on the fourth, because she'd noticed the cold store had exceptional quality river fish, and she wanted to know if he'd eat something lighter. He ate everything. On the fifth day, the note from Albert Parks contained an addition. His Majesty found the previous evening's meal adequate. He inquires whether you require anything from the market stores. Joni stared at the word adequate for a long moment. Then she wrote back, fennel, fresh, not dried, and better cream if there is any. The fennel arrived within the hour. The cream was the best she'd ever worked with. She made a fennel-braised chicken that evening that she was genuinely proud of, which was not a feeling she let herself have often because it seemed presumptuous. The next morning's note said, His Majesty asks if you were trained formally or in a family kitchen. Joni wrote back, family kitchen. My mother. She learned from her mother. She almost didn't add the last part. It felt too personal for whatever this was. She added it anyway. That afternoon, she heard footsteps stop outside the kitchen door. They stayed there for approximately 30 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be anything she could name, and then continued down the corridor. She kept her eyes on her work and did not acknowledge that her hands had gone very still. The problem announced itself on the 8th day, in the form of Nina Moyer. Nina was one of the palace's senior attendants, beautiful in the calculated way of someone who understood beauty as a professional asset, with sharp eyes and a manner so polished it occasionally felt like a weapon. She appeared in the doorway of the private kitchen at 10:30 in the morning without knocking, which told Joni everything she needed to know about how Nina viewed the room's occupant. You're the kitchen girl, Nina said. I'm the kitchen girl, Joni agreed, because there was no point in being anything other than agreeable when someone opened a conversation like that. Nina looked at her for a moment, with the particular assessment of someone cataloging a potential problem. People are talking, she said. People always talk, Joni said. She kept her hands moving. She was prepping stock, and stock didn't wait for social dynamics to resolve themselves. They're saying he's canceled 3 afternoons of council meetings this week. Nina stepped further into the kitchen, which Joni noted she hadn't been invited to do. That he's been eating in the private dining hall for extended periods, that Albert Parks has been seen going to the market stores on personal requests from the private kitchen. Said Joni. Do you understand what you're doing? Nina asked. Her voice had shifted, still polished, but with something harder underneath it now. Do you understand the position you're putting yourself in? Joni set down her knife. She turned around, because this was the kind of conversation that deserved eye contact even when you didn't particularly want to have it. I cook his meals, she said. That's all I'm doing. That's not all that's happening, Nina said. And you know it. The silence between them was uncomfortable in a specific way, the way of something true that neither party particularly wants to fully examine. Joni picked her knife back up. Is there something I can help you with? She asked. Or were you just stopping by to tell me people are talking, because I could have guessed that part on my own? Nina looked at her for another long moment. Be careful, she said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. Men like him don't notice people like us without a reason. And the reason is rarely good for the person being noticed. She left without waiting for a response. Joni stood in the quiet kitchen and stared at her stock, and tried very hard not to think about footsteps stopping outside her door for 30 seconds, and then walking away. She failed completely. That evening she made a mushroom and barley dish she'd been turning over in her mind for 3 days. Earthy and warming, the kind of thing that felt like staying in on a cold night. She plated it simply, the way she always did. Set the tray by the door. When she turned back to clean her station, the connecting door was open. Harold Hess was standing in the doorway of the private kitchen. Not in full formal dress, a simpler version, dark and plain, like something you'd wear when you'd stopped performing for the day. He was taller than she'd registered the first time, or maybe it was just that the kitchen was smaller than the dining hall, and there was less space for his presence to distribute itself. He looked at her. She looked at him. "The fennel chicken," he said. "Last week. What was the liquid you used for braising?" Joni's brain, which had been preparing for approximately 11 different versions of this moment, none of which had involved a question about braising liquid, took a moment to catch up. "White wine and stock," she said, with a small amount of honey at the end. Just enough to encourage the caramelization without. "Sweet but not sweet," he said. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." He nodded, once, like she'd confirmed something he'd been working out on his own. He looked at the mushroom and barley on the tray. Then he looked back at her with those dark, assessing eyes that were doing the complicated thing again, the thing she still didn't have a name for. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'd like to eat here, in the kitchen." Joni Francis opened her mouth. She thought about Nina Moyer's careful warning. She thought about the 20 silver coins still sitting on her windowsill in the servants' quarters. She thought about preferences, unknown, and trays coming back empty, and footsteps stopping outside her door. "All right," she said. Because she had never, not once in 23 years, successfully said no. And because, if she was being honest with herself, which she was trying very hard not to be, she didn't want to. Chapter 4. Harold Hess arrived at 7 o'clock exactly. Joni knew it was exactly 7, because she had been watching the clock above the hearth with the focused intensity of someone diffusing something explosive, and she had noted, with the detached calm of a person who was absolutely not nervous, that the second hand completed its final revolution at precisely the moment his knock landed on the kitchen door. He knocked. That was the first thing that derailed her. She had been expecting him to simply appear, the way powerful people appeared, without announcement, without consideration for whether the other person was ready, because powerful people generally assumed everyone was always ready for them. Half the palace staff she knew had stories about being caught mid-task by someone important, and the subsequent scramble to perform composure on zero notice. He knocked. 3 times, measured and unhurried, like someone who understood that this was her space and required permission to enter it. Joni stood at her prep counter with a wooden spoon in her hand and stared at the door for 2 full seconds before her body remembered how to respond. "Come in," she said. He came in. He was dressed simply again. She was beginning to understand this was a choice, that the formal court dress was a costume he wore for other people's benefit, and this, the plain dark clothes and the absence of ceremony, was something closer to what he actually was. He looked around the kitchen the way he'd looked at the bowl of lamb stew that first day, with genuine attention, taking inventory, not performing interest but actually having it. His gaze landed on the table she'd set. It was a small table, tucked against the wall near the hearth. She'd found it in the back of the cold storeroom, clearly unused for years, and she'd dragged it out and wiped it down and set 2 places, because it had seemed wrong to set one when she'd been told he was eating here. She'd used the plain kitchen dishes rather than the formal dining set, because the formal dining set seemed like the wrong register entirely for a kitchen table by a hearth. She'd also, without fully deciding to, put a small jar of dried herbs in the center of it, because the table looked bare otherwise, definitely for no other reason. Harold looked at the 2 place settings. "You're eating with me," he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a command either. It landed somewhere in between, an observation that was also an invitation, or possibly an invitation disguised as an observation. "I wasn't sure of the protocol," Joni said honestly. "I can eat after, if—" "Sit down," he said, pulling out the chair across from the one she'd clearly been planning to use. She sat down. He sat across from her. Joni picked up her spoon, put it down, picked it up again, and said, "The soup needs another 3 minutes." "Then we wait," he said. They waited. It should have been excruciating, by every reasonable measure, sitting in silence across a small kitchen table from the Alpha King of Valdenmoor, while soup finished cooking, should have been one of the more uncomfortable experiences of her adult life. It wasn't, quite. The hearth was going well, she'd built it up an hour ago, and the kitchen had that particular warmth that only a properly tended fire could create, the kind that settled into the walls and the floorboards and made the room feel smaller and safer than it actually was. The smell of the soup was filling the air, something slow and deep with rosemary running through it. Outside the small high window she could see the dark of early evening settling over the palace grounds. Harold Hess was looking at the fire. In profile, without the full weight of his attention directed at her, she could look at him properly for the first time. She made herself be clinical about it, the way you'd be clinical about noting that a storm was large or a river was fast. He was genuinely striking in the way that certain people were, not through any single feature but through the whole of them, the particular way they occupied space. There was something in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes that spoke of a person who had made a very large number of difficult decisions and was at peace with most of them. There was also, she noticed now, in the firelight, in the quiet, without the formal context of the dining hall, something tired in him. Not the surface tiredness of a long day. The deeper kind. She'd seen it before, on her father after a bad harvest, on her eldest brother during the winter their mother was sick. The tiredness that came from carrying something heavy for a very long time, without anyone to help you set it down. The timer she'd placed on the counter chimed softly. She got up and served the soup. He ate the way she was beginning to recognize, with complete attention, unhurried, like someone who had recently rediscovered that meals were worth being present for. He didn't make appreciative sounds or offer compliments mid-bite, which she'd half expected and half dreaded. He just ate, and the quality of his attention was its own kind of response. She ate too, which helped. Having something to do with her hands made the situation feel less like a performance. "Your mother," he said, when the soup was half finished. "She taught you this specifically? The layering?" Joni looked up. She said good cooking was just good listening. You pay attention to what the ingredients are telling you, and you don't argue with them. Something shifted in his expression. Small, but there. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." She was, Joni said. Then, because the past tense had landed in the room with a small weight, "She died when I was 17. Fever, the winter I was supposed to go to the merchant school in Caldermere." She hadn't planned to say that. It came out the way things sometimes did around him, without the usual editorial process, the checking and rechecking of what was appropriate. Like his particular quality of attention, made careful management of information feel unnecessary. "You didn't go," he said. "My brothers needed someone to manage the farm kitchen." She shrugged, the way you shrug at things that hurt less than they used to. "I didn't mind. I was better at cooking than I would have been at accounting." Harold was quiet for a moment. "You've been compensating for other people's gaps your entire life," he said. It was so precise, and so unexpected, that she put her spoon down. He was looking at her directly now, with that dark, steady gaze that she was starting to understand was not intimidation, or not only intimidation, but a specific kind of seeing. He paid attention the way he ate, completely, without performance. "That's a very specific thing to say to someone you met 8 days ago," she said. "It's what I observed," he said simply. "You covered a shift the day you arrived at the palace. You completed 3 other people's assigned prep work last week alone, according to my records." "You checked my records?" "I check everyone's records." A pause. "I checked yours more carefully." The kitchen was very warm. Joni picked her spoon back up, because it gave her somewhere to look. "I don't mind helping people," she said. "There's a difference between helping people and being unable to decline when they ask," he said. Not unkindly, just with the directness of someone who didn't see the point in approaching truth from an angle. "Is there?" she said. "Yes," he said. "One is a choice. The other is a habit, built from believing your own needs matter less than other people's comfort." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it. Joni stared at her soup. "With respect, Your Majesty," she said finally, "that's a remarkably personal observation from someone who hasn't told me a single thing about himself in 8 days of meals." She heard herself say it and had a brief, vivid experience of watching herself say it from outside her body, with the detached horror of someone watching a cart roll toward a cliff. Harold Hess looked at her. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, something in his face that had been held in careful stillness shifted. Not a smile, exactly, but the shape that lived next to one. "Fair," he said. And then, unprompted, without her asking, without any social mechanism requiring it, he said, "My father used to cancel dinners. Council ran late, or he was tired, or there was always something more pressing. I waited at the table for him once for 2 hours, before a servant told me he wasn't coming." A pause. "I was 9. I decided then that if I was going to be alone at a table, I'd prefer to be actually alone rather than waiting for someone who wasn't going to arrive." Joni looked at him. He was looking at the fire again, the same way he'd looked at it when she'd studied him in profile, with the distance of someone reporting on events rather than reliving them. "How long has it been?" she asked quietly. "Since you ate with someone?" He considered this with the seriousness of someone who didn't answer questions carelessly. 11 years, he said. Joni thought about that. About 11 years of solitary trays and untouched meals, and a table set for one in a small private dining hall. About preferences, unknown. "Well," she said, because she was Joni Francis, and when faced with something large and sad and true, her instinct was always to meet it with something warm and real. For what it's worth, the fennel chicken was better with company, even if the company didn't say so at the time. Harold turned back from the fire and looked at her. This time the shape next to a smile was close enough that she could see the actual architecture of it, what it would look like if it arrived fully, which she suspected was a rare event. "It was," he said. They finished the soup. He stayed until 8:30. When he left, he paused at the kitchen door, that same pause she'd heard from the corridor, the 30-second stop that had derailed 3 days of her careful equilibrium, and said, without turning around, "Tomorrow, 7 o'clock. I'll have the fennel ready," she said. The door closed. Joni Francis stood alone in her warm kitchen by her well-tended fire and pressed both hands flat against the prep counter and breathed very carefully for approximately 1 full minute. Then she started cleaning up. She told herself firmly, tidying with perhaps slightly more force than the dishes required. Just cooking his meals. That was all. That was absolutely, completely, entirely all this was. The jar of dried herbs sat in the center of the small kitchen table, and the hearth burned low and warm, and somewhere down the corridor she could hear his footsteps slowing, just slightly, just for a moment, before they continued on. She scrubbed the soup pot and did not think about it. She failed completely. Chapter 5. By the 3rd week, Harold Hess had cancelled so many afternoon appointments that Albert Parks had developed a nervous habit of checking his schedule twice before confirming anything, as though the act of looking at it twice might prevent it from being dismantled again. It was not preventing anything. The Eastern Ridge delegation had been rescheduled twice. The quarterly trade review had been moved to early morning. 3 separate council members had sent increasingly carefully worded notes inquiring about the Alpha King's availability, each one phrased with the diplomatic precision of people who understood that asking "why are you canceling everything to eat in a kitchen directly" would be career-limiting. Albert had not answered any of them directly either, because Albert was a man of considerable professional intelligence. What was happening, as far as Albert could observe, was this. The Alpha King was eating. Actually eating. Completely. Every tray, every meal, every evening sitting at a small kitchen table by a hearth for an hour, sometimes 2, and coming back to his study afterward with something in his expression that Albert, who had served Harold Hess for 9 years and catalogued every variation of his demeanor, had never seen before, and could not immediately name. Lighter, perhaps. Which was a word Albert would not have previously associated with his king, and which worried him considerably. Joni was aware of the cancelled appointments the same way she was aware of most palace information, through the particular osmosis of servant networks, which moved faster and more accurately than any official communication system. Carla had reported it first, appearing at the private kitchen door on a Tuesday morning, with the expression of someone delivering significant news. 3 afternoon cancellations this week, Carla said. The council is talking. The council is always talking, Joni said. She was making bread. Real bread, slow risen, the kind that took most of a morning, and she didn't look up from the dough. They're talking about you specifically, Carla said. Or rather, about the kitchen. About why he's spending 2 hours there every evening, instead of reviewing the territorial reports. He reviews the territorial reports in the morning, Joni said. I've seen the light under his study door when I come in at 6. A small silence. You know his study light schedule, Carla said. I walk past it every morning, Joni said, slightly too quickly. Carla looked at her with the expression of a woman who had known her for 4 years and was choosing, with great deliberate kindness, not to say what she was thinking. Just be careful, she said. That's all. It was the same thing Nina Moyer had said, and Joni liked hearing it from Carla considerably less, because Carla was someone whose judgment she respected. I'm being careful, she said. You made him a birthday cake, Carla said. I made him a cake because I overheard Albert mention his birthday in passing, and it was just a cake, Carla. A 3-layer honey cake with candied walnuts. The walnuts were already in the store. Joni. She punched the bread dough with slightly more force than necessary. I know, she said. I know, I'm aware. Are you? She didn't answer, because the honest answer was complicated in ways she wasn't ready to examine with an audience. The honest answer was that she was aware of approximately everything, in the way that awareness becomes its own specific problem. She was aware that he arrived at 7 o'clock exactly, every evening, without fail. She was aware that he knocked every time, without exception. She was aware that he had, over the past 3 weeks, told her more about himself than she suspected he had told most people in years. Not in grand revelations, but in the small, accumulated way of someone who had forgotten they were allowed to speak about themselves, and was relearning it carefully. She knew that he read for an hour before sleep, and that his preference was history over politics, which he found redundant. She knew that he had an opinion about proper stock technique that was both wrong and confidently held, and that the evening she had very politely told him so had been one of the most entertaining of her adult life. She knew that he took his tea without anything in it, and that he had strong feelings about the correct thickness of bread for a soup course. She knew that when something amused him genuinely, not the formal acknowledgement of humor that he deployed in official settings, but actual amusement, the corner of his left eye creased slightly before anything changed in his mouth. She was aware that she looked for it. She was very aware that she looked for it. I'm being careful, she said again, mostly to herself this time. Carla left the bread to prove, and didn't push further, which was either kindness or the recognition that some doors, once opened, couldn't easily be closed again. That evening Harold arrived at 7 o'clock, knocked 3 times, and came in to find Joni standing at the hearth with her back to the door and a pan that was refusing to behave. The heat's too high, he said, from directly behind her left shoulder. She startled badly enough that the pan shifted, and she grabbed the handle by reflex and immediately regretted it because it was very hot. She made a small, involuntary sound of pain. Harold moved before she'd registered he was moving, around her and her hand, gently taking the pan off the heat with a cloth he'd picked up from the counter, setting it aside, and then turning back and picking up her hand with the same calm, purposeful efficiency. The contact was startling enough that she went completely still. He turned her palm toward the light and examined the reddening line across it with the same focused attention he brought to everything. His hands were much larger than hers, she noted distantly. Warm, steadier than the situation probably required. Cold water, he said. Now. It's not. Now, Joni. She went to the cold water. He followed, keeping her hand under the flow for longer than she would have on her own. one hand cupped under hers and the other maintaining a light, steady pressure on her wrist she was being clinical. She was absolutely being clinical, oddly grounding. The heat was too high, she said, because silence felt dangerous. Yes, he agreed. I've been meaning to mention it for several evenings. You've been watching my heat levels? I pay attention when I'm somewhere, he said, as though it was simple, as though it wasn't one of the more disarming things anyone had said to her. The water ran cold over her hand, and he didn't let go, and the kitchen was warm and quiet, and Joni Frances stared at the sink and had a very serious conversation with herself about the precise difference between gratitude and whatever else was currently happening in her chest. She lost the argument comprehensively. Better? He asked. Yes, she said. Thank you. He released her hand slowly, not abruptly, not as though contact had suddenly become inappropriate and required immediate correction, but with the same unhurried quality that characterized everything he did. He stepped back a measured distance and looked at the abandoned pan. What were you making? Seared fish. The heat ruined it. I'll start again. Don't, he said. There's bread from this morning, and the cold store has the leftover barley from yesterday. She looked at him. You know what's in my cold store? I looked, he said simply. Yesterday, when you were getting water, I wanted to understand how you planned meals. You looked in my cold store to understand my meal planning process. Yes. That is, she said carefully, a very specific thing to be curious about. I'm a specific person, he said. They ate bread and cold barley by the hearth, which should have been a disappointing meal, and was instead one of the most comfortable evenings she could remember. He told her about the territorial dispute he'd spent the afternoon mediating, not in official terms but in the frank, slightly weary way of someone who'd spent too long managing other people's inability to share resources like adults. She told him about the bread she'd made that morning and the particular satisfaction of a slow-proved loaf, and he listened with the complete attention she was starting to need the way plants needed light, which was a thought she immediately and firmly buried. At 8:30, he rose to leave. At the door he stopped. Always. The pause. The same 30-second gravity that pulled at him before he could leave a room she was in, and said, Tomorrow I have counsel until 6. I may be late. I'll keep things warm, she said. He nodded, reached for the door, stopped again. Joni. Yes? He turned back, and in his expression was the particular quality of someone who has decided to say something true, even though truth has a cost. I have reviewed my schedule for the autumn court closing ceremony, he said. There is a formal banquet. Court expects me to appear with... A brief pause. The banquet requires a partner. Joni waited. I would like it to be you, he said. The kitchen was extremely quiet. Outside, wind moved through the palace grounds, and the fire settled in the hearth, and Joni Frances stood in the warm, small space that had somehow in 3 weeks become the most important room in her world, and looked at the most powerful man in 7 kingdoms, standing at her kitchen door asking her to a banquet. Her mouth opened. Every sensible instinct she possessed said, No. Say no. This is the moment to say no. You are a kitchen maid. He is an alpha king. There are approximately 40 structural reasons why this is a terrible idea, and 0 good reasons to agree, and you know this, you... All right, she said. Harold Hess held her gaze for a moment. Then, 7 o'clock, I'll send Albert with something appropriate to wear. You don't have to. I know, he said. I want to. He left. Joni stood in her kitchen with her burned hand and her cold barley and her jar of dried herbs and stared at the closed door. From somewhere in the palace, she could hear the distant sounds of the autumn court gathering, music, voices, the momentum of a world that moved in patterns and hierarchies and rules she understood very well. She pressed her good hand flat against the prep counter. She told herself firmly, quietly, very sincerely, just cooking his meals. That was all. That was all. The bread on the table was still warm, and the hearth burned low and gold, and she had said yes when every part of her that wasn't secretly, quietly, terrifyingly falling should have said no. She had always been better at yes than no. and for the first time in her life, she was genuinely unsure whether that was a flaw. Chapter 6. Albert Parks arrived at her door at 5:30 with a dress box, an expression of carefully maintained neutrality, and the energy of a man who had accepted that his life had taken an unexpected turn and was managing it with professional dignity. "His Majesty asked me to deliver this," Albert said, holding out the box with both hands, like an offering at a particularly confusing altar. Joni took it. "Albert," she said carefully, "how much trouble am I in?" Albert considered this with genuine seriousness, which told her more than a dismissive answer would have. "That depends," he said, "on what you mean by trouble." "The kind where people get hurt," she said. Albert was quiet for a moment. He was a precise man, thin and careful, with the posture of someone who had spent decades in service to power and understood its geometry intimately. "His Majesty," Albert said slowly, "has not cancelled a scheduled engagement for personal reasons in 9 years of my service. He has not requested market provisions for his own preference. Ever. He has not." A pause. "He arrived at his morning council session yesterday, and one of the senior lords made a remark about the kitchen arrangements. His Majesty looked at the lord in a way that I have not seen him look at anyone since the Caldermere Treaty dispute of 4 years ago." Joni stared at him. "What kind of look?" "The kind," Albert said, with the precision of a man choosing words surgically, "that ends careers." He left before she could respond. She stood holding the dress box and felt, in the quiet of the servants' corridor, the particular sensation of standing at the edge of something that was already in motion and could not be stopped by wanting it to stop. The dress was deep green, simply cut, made of something so fine she was almost afraid to touch it with kitchen-roughened hands. No ornament, no embellishment, just the color and the quality and the particular statement of something chosen by someone who knew exactly what they were choosing and why. She stared at herself in the small mirror in her quarters for a long moment. She looked like someone else. Not unrecognizable, still herself, still the farmer's daughter from Valdenmore's outer territories, still the girl who couldn't say no and had stumbled into a palace kitchen and stayed because the work was honest and the hearth was warm. But also, in the green dress with her hair managed into something approximating elegance, something else. Something that could walk into a formal banquet and not immediately betray itself. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Harold was waiting at the entrance to the great hall. He was in formal dress, the full formal dress, not the plain dark clothing of their kitchen evenings, and the difference was instructive. The formal Harold Hess was the one the 7 kingdoms knew, severe and still, and carrying authority in every line of him, the kind of presence that made rooms rearrange themselves around it. He saw her cross the corridor. The formal Harold Hess, for approximately 3 seconds, was not entirely present. Something happened in his expression that she didn't have a name for, and that made her grateful for the width of the corridor between them. Then he composed himself, which she noted with the specific attention of someone who had spent 3 weeks learning how his face worked, and came forward. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said, because if he said something kind right now, she was going to have to excuse herself for a moment and collect her composure from wherever it had gone. He stopped, looked at her. The corner of his left eye creased, just slightly. "Ready?" he said instead. "Absolutely not," she said honestly. He offered his arm. She took it, because there was no version of Joni Francis who could decline an offered arm from Harold Hess in a formal corridor while wearing a green dress that cost more than her monthly wage. They walked into the Great Hall together. The Great Hall during the Autumn Court closing banquet was the most intimidating room Joni had ever been in, and she had once been accidentally locked in Edmund's spice vault for 2 hours, so her tolerance for confined, intimidating spaces was not low. It was vast and gold-lit, full of every significant noble family in 7 kingdoms, all of whom turned when the Alpha King entered, and all of whom then, in a ripple that moved through the room like a slow, collective recalibration, registered the woman on his arm. The silence was very brief. The subsequent noise was not. Joni kept her eyes forward, her hand steady on Harold's arm, and deployed the strategy she had developed over 4 years of palace life for managing situations that exceeded her comfort level. She focused on the immediate physical detail in front of her and refused to process the wider context until she had somewhere quiet to do it. Immediate physical detail. The table was set beautifully. The centerpiece arrangement was the one Edmund had won the argument about with the royal steward, and it was, she could admit, genuinely excellent. The first course was already plated, a consommé she recognized from the main kitchen's preparation, clear and precise, the kind of thing Edmund made when he was proving a point. Harold held her chair. She sat. He sat beside her, not across, beside, which placed him close enough that she was aware of the specific warmth of him and the way he oriented slightly toward her, even when he was addressing someone else. The lord to his left, a large, florid man named Douglas Vane, who had the bearing of someone accustomed to being the loudest person in any room, leaned forward almost immediately. "Your Majesty," Douglas said, with the particular smile of someone gathering information while appearing sociable. "You'll have to introduce us." "Joni Francis," Harold said. His voice was pleasant and completely final, in the way that doors are pleasant when they're being closed. "She runs my private kitchen." A pause. "Ah," said Douglas. "How charming." Harold looked at him. Douglas's smile recalibrated slightly. "The consommé is excellent," Joni said, because silence at a dinner table made her professionally uncomfortable regardless of context, and also because redirecting via food was the most natural thing she knew how to do. Douglas blinked, apparently surprised that she'd spoken. "Is it?" he said, with the automatic condescension of someone who hadn't expected to be addressed. "Edmund's stock technique is the best in the kingdom," she said pleasantly. "He renders it twice, which most kitchens don't bother with because it's time-consuming. But you can taste the difference. There's a clarity you can't achieve any other way. The depth is there, but it's not heavy. Do you get that?" Douglas looked at his consommé, looked at Joni, looked at his consommé again, as though it had become more complicated. Yes, he said, slightly uncertainly. "I suppose I do." "Edmund will be pleased," she said, and smiled, and turned back to her own bowl. Under the table, Harold's hand found hers briefly, just for a moment, just the light pressure of fingers over knuckles, and then withdrew. She kept her expression completely neutral and catalogued it away in the locked room in her mind that was getting very full. The evening was long and strange, and not entirely what she'd expected, which she realized said something about how thoroughly she'd failed to think through what she expected. She'd expected to be ignored, or managed, or treated with the particular brand of polite invisibility that palace society deployed toward people outside its hierarchy. She'd expected to be tolerated as an anomaly, the kitchen girl at the Alpha King's table, filed under inexplicable personal eccentricity and managed accordingly. What happened instead was Harold. Harold, who drew her into conversation with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about how to make her comfortable in an uncomfortable situation. Who asked her questions in company that he already knew the answers to from their evenings, because the questions gave her platform and context. Who managed Douglas Vane and two other probing nobles with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 11 years getting very good at ending conversations without appearing to end them. Who, at one point during the third course, leaned slightly toward her and said in a voice low enough for only her, "The sauce is oversalted." She looked at the plate. Tasted it. "By about a quarter teaspoon," she agreed, equally quiet. Edmund's sous chef gets nervous during formal events. His hand shakes on the salt. "Can you taste the nervousness?" "Every time," she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the table, but the corner of his left eye was doing the thing. She looked away before he could see her expression doing anything unmanageable. It was during the dessert course that Nina Moyer appeared. Not at the table. Nina was seated 3 places down, among the senior palace attendants, but in Joni's peripheral awareness, with the specific quality of attention that meant someone was watching her with purpose. She didn't look directly. She'd learned early in palace life that direct acknowledgement invited engagement, but she felt it, the careful, assessing weight of it, and underneath it, something else, something that wasn't quite hostility, wasn't quite warning, but occupied the complicated territory between the two. When the banquet concluded and Harold was occupied with a formal exchange with one of the Eastern Ridge representatives, Nina appeared at Joni's elbow with the smooth inevitability of water finding a level. "You carry it well," Nina said quietly. "The green." "Thank you," Joni said. "He chose it," Nina said. "Not a question." "Albert delivered it," Joni said carefully. "Albert delivers what Harold selects." Nina was quiet for a moment. Around them the hall was beginning its courteous dissolution, nobles taking their leave in careful order of precedence. "I want you to understand something, not as a warning, as information." Joni waited. "There are people in this court," Nina said, "who have been waiting for him to show a vulnerability for 11 years. He has not given them one." A pause. "Until now." Joni looked at her. Nina's expression was not unkind. It was the expression of someone who understood certain things clearly, and was choosing to share that understanding, rather than withhold it. "You are not the problem," Nina said. "You are the evidence. And the people who want to use it don't particularly care what happens to the evidence when they're done." She moved away before Joni could respond. Joni stood in the dissolving warmth of the great hall, in her green dress, with the ghost of a hand over hers, and the echo of a near laugh still somewhere in her chest, and felt the evening rearrange itself around her into something more complicated than it had been an hour ago. Harold appeared at her side. "Ready?" he said. She looked at him, the formal exterior, the careful composure, and underneath it, just barely visible to someone who had spent 3 weeks learning the architecture of his silences, the thing that was lighter than it used to be, the vulnerability Nina had named. "Yes," she said. They walked out of the great hall together, and the court watched them go, and Joni Francis understood for the first time, with a clarity that sat in her chest like a stone, that yes had consequences she wasn't sure she'd fully accounted for. She'd said it anyway. She always did. Chapter 7. The morning after the banquet, Joni woke up before dawn and lay in the dark of her small servants' quarters, and had a very serious, very honest conversation with herself. It went like this. "You are a kitchen maid. He is an alpha king. You cook his meals. That is the beginning and the end of what you are to each other. Everything else is warmth and proximity, and the particular vulnerability of someone who hasn't been properly fed in 4 years suddenly being fed, and you are confusing his hunger for something it isn't, and you need to stop." She lay there for a while longer. Then she got up and went to the private kitchen at 6 o'clock, and made his breakfast tray with the same care she always brought to it, because whatever conversation she was having with herself, the work was still the work, and she'd been raised to do things properly. She left the tray by the connecting door. She did not think about the green dress, which she had folded very carefully and placed in the box it came in, meaning to return it to Albert. She thought about it constantly. The knock came at 7:30. Not the kitchen door. Her kitchen door. The one that faced the servants' corridor, which Harold had never knocked on because Harold came through the connecting door from the dining hall in the evenings, and there was no reason for him to be on this side at 7:30 in the morning. She opened it. It was not Harold. It was a woman she had never seen before, which was itself unusual in the insular geography of palace life, where faces became familiar quickly. She was perhaps 30, beautifully dressed in traveling clothes that suggested a very recent arrival, with dark eyes that assessed Joni with the rapid efficiency of someone accustomed to making quick determinations about people. "You're the one cooking his meals," the woman said. "Can I help you?" Joni said. "My name is Rebecca Cassidy," the woman said. "I'm Harold's cousin, and I need to talk to you about what you're doing." Rebecca Cassidy came into the kitchen the way people came into spaces they intended to control, all the way in, taking the chair nearest the hearth without being offered it, looking around the room with the careful attention of someone mapping territory. Joni made tea because it gave her something to do, and because her mother had taught her that difficult conversations were always slightly better, with something warm in your hands. "How long have you known him?" Rebecca asked. 3 weeks, Joni said. "And in 3 weeks he's cancelled 8 scheduled engagements, attended a formal banquet with a kitchen maid on his arm, and according to Albert Parks has begun reviewing his morning correspondence while sitting in this kitchen, rather than his study." Rebecca accepted the tea. Do you understand what that represents in the context of 11 years of his behavior? I understand it's unusual, Joni said carefully. It's not unusual, Rebecca said. It's unprecedented. Harold has not, in 11 years, altered his professional schedule for a personal reason. Not once. She paused. He did it 8 times in 3 weeks. Joni wrapped both hands around her own cup. What do you want me to understand? She asked. Because Rebecca Cassidy had not come to her kitchen at 7:30 in the morning to deliver information for its own sake. There was a point arriving, and she could feel its shape. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, looking at her tea. I love my cousin, she said. That's important context for everything I'm about to say. I am not his enemy, and I am not yours. A pause. But I have watched him for 11 years become someone who has systematically removed every personal attachment from his life, because personal attachments are leverage, because anyone he cares about becomes a target, because the political geography of 7 kingdoms means that a vulnerability in the Alpha King is an opportunity for someone else. Joni thought about Nina Moyer saying, "You are the evidence." He knows this, Rebecca continued. He has always known this. It's why he built the walls he built. And now, in 3 weeks, you have... She stopped, chose her words. You have done something I genuinely did not think anyone could do, and I need you to understand what it means. For him, and for you. Tell me, Joni said. There is a lord, Rebecca said, named Julius Baron. He controls the northern trade routes. He has been looking for a way to bring pressure on Harold for 2 years because Harold refused to grant him the toll rights he wanted, and Julius Baron does not accept refusal gracefully. She met Joni's eyes. Yesterday, after the banquet, Julius Baron was seen in extended conversation with 3 other council members. This morning, Albert received an inquiry from the council about the appropriateness of the Alpha King's personal arrangements. The kitchen was very quiet. They're going to use me, Joni said. Not a question. They're going to try to use you, Rebecca said. To embarrass him, to force him to publicly distance himself from you, which will cost him something, or to refuse to distance himself, which will cost him more. Either way, Julius Baron gets leverage he has spent 2 years trying to find. Joni set down her tea. She looked at the hearth, the same hearth she'd built up 3 weeks ago on the first evening Harold had sat at her small table, and felt something settle in her chest that was very cold and very clear. So what are you asking me to do? She said. Rebecca looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to do anything, she said. I'm giving you information. What you do with it is your choice. A pause. But I want you to understand the full picture before you make that choice. Not just what this is for you, what it is for him. And what is it for him? Joni asked. Even though she suspected she knew. Even though the knowing of it was sitting in the center of her chest like something she'd swallowed whole. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. He hasn't canceled 8 appointments in 11 years, she said softly. Do the math, Joni. She did the math. She did it all morning, while Harold's breakfast tray sat empty by the connecting door, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary sounds of the palace coming to life around her, and she prepped the midday meal with automatic hands and a very busy mind. She thought about a 9-year-old boy waiting 2 hours at a dinner table. She thought about preferences, unknown and 11 years of untouched trays. She thought about his hand over hers under the banquet table, brief and careful, and the corner of his left eye doing the thing she looked for now without meaning to. She thought about Julius Baron and council inquiries and the word leverage, and Nina saying you are the evidence. She thought about her mother's kitchen, warm and small, and the particular safety of a space where someone made food with intention, and the person eating it knew it. She thought about how she had given him that, how she had watched it work, meal by meal, evening by evening, the careful reconstruction of something in him that had been empty for a very long time. And she thought about what Rebecca had said. He hasn't canceled 8 appointments in 11 years. She was still doing the math when the connecting door opened at noon and Harold came in. Not at 7 o'clock, not in the evening, but at noon, which had never happened before, which meant he'd reorganized his morning for it, and stopped when he saw her face. He was very still for a moment. Rebecca came, he said, not a question. Albert's information network, she noted distantly, apparently moved in both directions. Yes, she said. He came in fully, closing the door behind him, and stood at the edge of the kitchen with the careful posture of someone who had approached a situation that required care. What did she say? He asked. She told me about Julius Baron, Joni said, about the council inquiry, about what I represent in terms of political geometry. Harold's jaw tightened, fractionally. Julius Baron is a problem I have managed before, and will manage again. He doesn't. She also told me, Joni said quietly, what it means, that you've cancelled 8 appointments. He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. Harold Hess looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and she looked back at him, and between them was 3 weeks of evenings, and bread and cold barley, and the near laugh and the hand under the table, and all the small accumulated weight of something that had happened without either of them fully deciding it was happening. I know what it means, she said. I'm not pretending I don't know. Then what are you pretending? He said, not unkindly, with the directness that was simply how he moved through truth. She looked at her hands. That I'm just cooking your meals, she said. I've been pretending that, for 3 weeks. The silence stretched. Joni, he said. The council is going to make it difficult, she said. Julius Baron is going to make it difficult. People are going to ask questions about what I am to you, and the answers are going to cause you problems, and you have 7 kingdoms to manage, and you cannot afford. Let me decide what I can afford, he said. I'm a kitchen maid, she said. The words came out flat and clear, the way true things do when you finally stop dressing them up. I'm a farmer's daughter from the outer territories, who got here on someone else's examination pass, and has been peeling potatoes for 4 years. I don't know politics. I don't know diplomacy. I can't help you with Julius Baron, or the Eastern Ridge, or the trade routes, or any of the actual machinery of what your life is. I'm not asking you to, he said. You should be, she said. That's my point. You should need someone who can. She finally looked up. You deserve someone who walks into that banquet hall and knows every person in the room, and understands the geometry of it, and can help you navigate it. Not someone who redirects aggressive nobles by talking about consommé technique, because it's the only tool she has. Harold was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. That was the best moment of the evening, he said quietly. Harold, you redirected Douglas Vane, he said. Douglas Vane, who has survived 4 administrations and 2 succession crises, stopped in his tracks by a woman talking about stock rendering. The corner of his left eye creased. I have been trying to shut Douglas Vane up in council for 6 years. Despite everything, despite the cold, clear thing sitting in her chest, and Rebecca's careful words, and the math she'd been doing all morning, something in her almost laughed. She pressed it down. This is serious, she said. I know it is, he said, and the almost lightness went out of him, replaced by something that was equally him, but older and heavier and more honest. I know exactly how serious it is. I have known, Joni. I have known since approximately the 4th evening what was happening and what it would cost, and I am not unaware of the consequences. Then why? Because I have been managing consequences for 11 years, he said. And I have been alone for 11 years. And for 3 weeks I have come into this kitchen at 7 o'clock, and sat at that table, and eaten food that someone made with intention, and talked to someone who tells me when I'm wrong about stock technique, and I have felt... He stopped. The word that would have come next sat in the air between them, unspoken, present. Joni looked at him. He looked back. I felt like a person, he said quietly. Not a king, not a function. A person who was hungry, and was being fed, and was allowed to be that. Just that. The kitchen was completely silent. Outside, the palace made its ordinary sounds. Footsteps, distant voices, the mechanical life of a vast institution continuing regardless of what happened in small, warm rooms. Joni Francis stood in her kitchen and looked at Harold Hess, and felt, with a completeness that left no room for the usual self-protective architecture, the full weight of what 3 weeks had built between them. And she felt, with equal completeness, the full weight of what Rebecca had told her. You are the evidence, And the people who want to use it don't particularly care what happens to the evidence when they're done. She was not afraid for herself. That was the thing she understood, standing there with the cold, clear thing in her chest. She was afraid for him. "I need to think," she said. Harold held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. The nod of someone who understood that some answers required time, and would not ask for speed as a substitute for truth. He left through the connecting door. The kitchen was very quiet. Joni sat down at the small table by the hearth, the table she'd dragged out of the cold store and wiped down and set with plain dishes, because the formal set was the wrong register entirely, and put her head in her hands. The jar of dried herbs sat in the center of the table. The hearth burned low. She sat there for a long time. Chapter 8. She made dinner at 7 o'clock. She didn't know what else to do with her hands, so she cooked. The slow, automatic movements of someone who had learned that work was the most reliable way to move through something difficult. She made the fennel chicken, his favorite, though he'd never used that word. She knew it was his favorite the way she knew most things about him now, not because he'd said so directly, but because of the particular quality of his silence when he ate it. The way the tension in his shoulders released by a specific degree. The way he always finished it completely, even on evenings when he arrived late and tired. She plated it simply, set it on the small table, sat down across from his empty chair, and decided. He knocked at 7 o'clock exactly. Came in, saw the table, both places set, the fennel chicken, the low fire, and something in his expression shifted into a careful, tentative warmth that she had to look away from because looking at it directly was more than she could manage right now. He sat down. She sat down. They ate in silence for a while, the companionable kind that had developed between them over weeks of evenings, the silence of two people who had learned each other's rhythms well enough that quiet didn't require filling. She let it last as long as she could. Then she set down her fork. "I've been thinking," she said. Harold set down his fork too. He looked at her with the focused, complete attention she had come to understand was simply how he listened, without performance, without the social mechanics of appearing engaged. Just actual presence. "Tell me," he said. "Rebecca is right," she said. "Not about everything, but about the important part." She kept her voice steady, which cost her something. "I am a liability, not because of who I am, specifically, because of what I am to you, because of what it's visible that I am to you." He was very still. "Julius Barron isn't going to stop," she said. "The council inquiry isn't going to go away, and there will be more. There will always be more, because that's what the political geometry is. You know that better than I do." She looked at him. "And I cannot help you with any of it. I wasn't wrong this morning. I don't know diplomacy. I don't know 7 kingdoms. I can talk about consommé and redirect one aggressive lord one time, but that's not a sustainable strategy for protecting you from people who want to use me against you." "I don't need protecting," he said quietly. "You need someone in your corner who knows the battlefield," she said. "Someone who can stand next to you in that hall and actually be useful. Not someone who is actively being used as a weapon against you by people who are better at this than I am." "Joni, I'm going to ask Edmund to reassign me," she said. "Back to the main kitchen. I think." Her voice almost broke on the next part, and she held it together by sheer will, because this was the right thing, and right things deserved to be said properly. "I think it's better, for you, if we go back to how it was." The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. Harold Hess looked at her across the small kitchen table, with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the formal composure, or the careful authority, or even the rare almost lightness she'd learned to look for. This was something underneath all of those, something older and more unguarded. Something that looked, she thought, with a small private devastation, exactly like loss. "You've decided," he said. "I've thought about it," she said. "Yes. And if I told you that I don't want you to go—" "I know you don't," she said softly. "That's why I have to." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him do what she imagined he had been doing for 11 years. Take something difficult and move it to the part of himself that could manage it, that could absorb it, without showing its full cost. The careful, practiced construction of composure. She hated that she knew what it looked like from the inside. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll speak to Edmund in the morning." He nodded. Once. The way he nodded at hard decisions in council when the decision was made and had to be respected, even when it was wrong. They sat at the small table for another hour. Neither of them ate very much. The fennel chicken went mostly unfinished, which had never happened before, and which cost her more than she'd expected it to. At 8:30, he rose to leave. At the door he stopped. She waited for the pause, the familiar 30-second gravity, the small pull before he could leave a room she was in. It lasted longer than 30 seconds this time. "Joni," he said. His voice was very quiet. Very even. The evenness of something controlled by effort. "Yes," she said. A long moment. "Thank you," he said, "for the meals." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "You're welcome," she said. "For the meals." The door closed. She sat alone at the small table in her warm kitchen and looked at the unfinished plate across from her, and the empty chair, and the jar of dried herbs in the center of the table, and she was very, very still for a very long time. Then she got up and cleaned the kitchen. Thoroughly, methodically, every surface, every pot, every utensil back in its place. She left the private kitchen at 10 o'clock with it in perfect order. She did not look back. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark of her servants' quarters and stared at the ceiling, and felt, with a precision she would have preferred not to have, every specific thing she was going to miss. 7 o'clock and 3 knocks. The corner of his left eye. Preferences, unknown becoming preferences known, catalogued, anticipated. The way he'd said I felt like a person, not a king, just that. She turned over and faced the wall, and was quiet and firm with herself, in the way she'd been quiet and firm with herself about difficult things her whole life, which was to say imperfectly, with significant internal noise, but without external collapse. She was almost asleep when she heard it. Voices, down the corridor, not the servants' corridor, the main one, raised in a way that palace voices rarely were, because raised voices in palaces meant something had gone wrong. She sat up. The words were indistinct at first. Then, as she moved to the door and cracked it open, they clarified into something she understood, in pieces, with the slow dawning horror of a person putting together a picture they don't want to see completed. Albert Parks's voice, high and tight, stripped of its professional composure. Another voice she didn't immediately recognize. And then words that arranged themselves into meaning. Shifted 3 hours ago, he won't respond, the wolf is. Happens when the bond is. Never seen him like this, Albert, he's... Joni was in the corridor before she'd decided to be there. The door to Harold's private study was open. Albert was in the corridor outside it with 2 senior attendants and a palace physician, all of them wearing the specific expressions of people who were frightened, and managing it with professionalism, which meant they were very frightened indeed. Albert saw her. Something in his face, relief, she thought, and the thought was terrifying, shifted. "Miss Frances," he said. "What happened?" she said. "His Majesty is..." Albert stopped, chose words carefully. "His wolf is very close to the surface. He is not responding to standard protocols. The physician cannot get near him." "What does that mean?" she said. "Not responding how?" "It means," Albert said, very quietly, "that the Alpha King has not spoken or moved in 3 hours, and the wolf that shares his body is in a state of significant distress, and is making it very clear that it does not want anyone in that room." She looked at the open door. From inside the study she could hear, not quite sound, more like pressure, a frequency at the edge of hearing that pressed against the inside of her chest and felt, inexplicably, like grief. "Let me in," she said. "Miss Frances, the physician cannot." "I'm not the physician," she said. "Let me in, Albert." Albert looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped aside. The study was dark except for the fire, which was burning low. Harold was by the window, standing, not collapsed, which she registered with a relief that told her how frightened she'd actually been, but the standing was not right, not his standing. Too still, too contained, like something held in check by a very thin margin. She could feel it from the doorway. A pressure in the room that was not temperature or light but something older, something alpha, something wolf, something that had been pushed past a threshold it rarely reached. She stepped inside. He turned. His eyes were wrong, not fully his, or rather, not only his. Gold threading through the dark, the wolf present in a way she'd never seen before, the two of them overlaid in a way that looked painful from the outside. She thought, I did this. She thought it very clearly, and it sat in her chest next to the cold thing from this morning, and she let it sit there, because it was true and she didn't believe in looking away from true things. She walked toward him. The pressure in the room increased. A warning, not threatening, not aimed at her specifically, but present. The wolf reading her approach and deciding. She kept walking. She stopped 2 feet from him. He was looking at her with the gold-threaded eyes and the terrible stillness, and she looked back at him and said, very quietly, I'm sorry. His jaw tightened. I made the wrong call, she said. Not about the reasons. The reasons were true, but she stopped. Started again. I kept cooking for you because I couldn't say no, and then I stopped because I was trying to protect you. And both of those things were about what I thought was best for you, without asking you, without treating you like someone who got to have an opinion about his own. She stopped. Because he had moved. Not dramatically, not the way things moved in stories, with speed and collision and decisive gesture. He had simply, quietly, crossed the 2 feet between them and put his forehead down against hers. That was all. Just that. Forehead to forehead, eyes closed, the terrible stillness replaced by something that was its own kind of stillness. Stiller, quieter, the stillness of something that had found the thing it was looking for. Joni stood in the low-lit study and breathed. She could feel the wolf settle, not vanish, settle, like a fire brought down from roaring to warm, the same heat, the same presence, but no longer consuming. She lifted one hand, set it against his jaw. He exhaled, long, slow, the sound of something that had been held for hours finally being released. I'm not going back to the main kitchen, she said quietly, unless you tell me to. Against her forehead, she felt him shake his head, once. Good, she said. The fire burned low. The study was very quiet. Outside, she could hear Albert Parks dismissing the physician and the attendants with the brisk efficiency of a man who understood that some situations resolved better without an audience, and she was grateful for him in a way she'd remember later. For now she stood in the near dark with her hand against Harold's jaw and his forehead against hers and felt, underneath the cold, clear thing she'd been carrying all day, something else. Something warm. Something that had been there for 3 weeks without her permission and was done, apparently, pretending otherwise. Harold, she said. Yes, he said. His voice was rough, like something that hadn't been used properly for hours. I'm going to make you breakfast tomorrow, she said, at 6 o'clock, and you're going to tell me everything you know about Julius Barron. A pause. Why? Because, she said, if he's going to use me as leverage, I would like to understand the mechanism, so I can help you dismantle it. She paused. I can't do diplomacy, but I'm very good at understanding what people are hungry for, and what they'll trade for it. He lifted his head, looked at her. The gold was fading from his eyes, his own dark returning, the wolf settled and present but no longer overwhelming. You're going to outmaneuver Julius Barron, he said slowly, using cooking. I'm going to outmaneuver Julius Barron, she said, using the same thing I used on Douglas Vane. Understanding what people actually want, which is almost never what they say they want. She met his eyes. He doesn't want leverage. He wants the toll rights. What would it take to give him something better than the toll rights? Harold was quiet for a long moment. The corner of his left eye creased. Just slightly. You, he said, with a specific wonder, are completely unexpected. I've been told, she said. He looked at her for another moment, the full weight of his attention, that complete and unperformed focus, and then he did something he had never done before. He smiled. Not the almost, not the shape next to it, the actual thing. Joni Francis looked at Harold Hess smiling in the low light of his private study, and felt the last of the cold, clear thing in her chest dissolve completely into something warm and irreversible. 6 o'clock, he said. 6 o'clock, she confirmed. She stayed until the fire needed tending. Then she tended it, because she was Joni Francis and she took care of things, and when it was burning warm and steady, she finally went back to her quarters. She slept, this time, deeply and without difficulty, in the way of someone who has stopped pretending and can finally rest. Chapter 9. She arrived at the private kitchen at 6 o'clock exactly. Harold was already there. Not in his formal dress, not in the plain dark clothing of their evenings, in something in between, the kind of thing you wore when you'd been up before dawn working and hadn't yet performed the day for anyone. His hair was slightly less composed than usual. There were papers spread across the small kitchen table, held flat by the herb jar she'd left in the center of it, and he was reading one of them with the focused intensity she recognized from his eating. Complete, unperformed attention. He looked up when she came in. She looked at him. Something passed between them that wasn't spoken and didn't need to be. An acknowledgement of last night, of foreheads and settled wolves and fires tended, that existed now as a fixed point between them and required no further examination to be real. "You made coffee," she said, "because there was a pot on the hearth. Albert showed me how the hearth operates," he said. "I got it wrong twice." She looked at the hearth. There were, she noted, faint scorch marks on the hearthstone that hadn't been there yesterday. "I can see that," she said. The corner of his left eye creased. She tied on her apron and started breakfast. Julius Barron, as it turned out, was a very hungry man. Not for food, though Harold reported that he ate extravagantly and well, which Joni filed as information. No, Julius Barron was hungry for the specific thing that powerful people who felt overlooked were always hungry for. Recognition. "He had the toll rights for 6 years under my father," Harold said, accepting the plate she set in front of him. Eggs, good bread, something simple because 6 o'clock was not the hour for elaborate cooking. "My father gave them to him as a political favor, and then spent 6 years complaining about the decision to anyone who would listen. So he had the thing, and knew it was given grudgingly," Joni said. "He knew he was tolerated, not valued." "Correct. And when you removed the toll rights, I restructured the entire Northern trade network. The decision was purely logistical. Julius Barron was incidental to it." Harold paused. "I didn't communicate that well." Joni looked at him. "You told a man who already felt overlooked that he was incidental." "I told the council the Northern trade restructure was a logistical decision. Julius Barron was in the room." "Harold, I know," he said. "I know that now." She sat down across from him with her own coffee and looked at the papers spread across the table. Trade documents, route maps, a detailed breakdown of the Northern toll structure that was covered in Harold's precise marginalia. "He doesn't want the toll rights back," she said slowly, working through it. "Or not only that, he wants to not be incidental." "He wants power," Harold said. "He wants to matter," she corrected. "Those are related, but not identical." Harold looked at her over his coffee. "What's the difference?" "Power you can take," she said. "Mattering someone has to give you. You can't seize it, you can't buy it, you can't threaten someone into genuinely believing you're important to them." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He's been using the toll rights as a proxy for the real thing, because the real thing isn't available to him through the channels he knows how to use." A long silence. Harold was looking at her with the assessing expression she'd first seen in the dining hall, the one that meant he was categorizing something unexpected and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. "So what do you give him?" he said. "You give him a table," she said simply. It took her 3 days to explain what she meant, and 2 weeks to make it happen. The table in question was not metaphorical, though it was also metaphorical. It was a dinner table, specifically, a small, private working dinner, between Harold and a select group of Northern lords, convened under the auspices of reviewing the restructured trade network with direct input from the people it affected. Julius Barron's name was at the top of the guest list. Not because he was the most powerful lord in the room, he wasn't, quite, but because Harold sent his invitation separately, 2 days before the others, with a handwritten note that Joni had spent an evening helping him draft and redraft until it said what it needed to say, without saying too much. The note acknowledged the toll restructure, acknowledged the lack of direct consultation with the Northern Lords most affected, and invited Julius Baron's specific expertise and counsel on the revised network, framing it as something the Council's decision had been incomplete without. "You're making him feel necessary," Harold said, reading the final draft at the kitchen table. "I'm making him be necessary," Joni said. "There's a difference. If you're going to give him a seat, it has to be a real one." "And what do I get in return?" "A Northern Lord who has something invested in your success instead of your embarrassment," she said, "and information about the trade network that you probably should have had 2 years ago anyway." Harold was quiet. "You understand," he said slowly, "that what you're describing is diplomacy." "I'm describing feeding someone what they're actually hungry for," she said. "I've been doing that my whole life. I just usually use an actual pot." The dinner was scheduled for a Thursday. On the Wednesday before it, Joni cooked for the first time outside the private kitchen. Not the main kitchen, the private dining hall, expanded for the occasion with 2 additional tables arranged by Albert with his characteristic geometric precision. She worked with Edmund for the menu, which required a conversation she'd been slightly dreading, but which turned out to be the most professionally satisfying hour of her recent life. Because Edmund, underneath the terrifying exterior and the hollandaise-related cruelty, was a man who deeply loved good cooking and could not sustain his own intimidation in the face of genuine culinary conversation. "The Northern Lords are meat and root vegetable people," Edmund said, peering at her proposed menu with narrowed eyes. "This," he pointed at her 3rd course, "is too refined." "It's refined in a Northern way," she said. "Look at the technique. It's a braised preparation, slow, heavy on the stock. The presentation is simple. It's the food they know made with better ingredients." Edmund peered at it longer. He said, which from Edmund was the equivalent of enthusiastic applause. She cooked the dinner with Edmund's team supporting her, which was both efficient and slightly surreal. 4 years of being junior to these people, and now directing the preparation, with Harold standing occasionally in the kitchen doorway, in a way that Edmund very carefully did not acknowledge, but that every other member of the kitchen staff absolutely did. After the 3rd time Harold appeared in the doorway, Edmund appeared at Joni's elbow. "The king," Edmund said, in the quiet voice he reserved for significant statements, "has been in my kitchen doorway more times this evening than in the previous 11 years combined." "I know," Joni said. "This is unprecedented," Edmund said. "I know," Joni said. Edmund looked at her for a moment. "The reduction on the 3rd course," he said, "half a minute more." Which was, she understood, Edmund's version of a blessing. The dinner itself she did not attend. She stayed in the private kitchen and listened to the distant sounds of it, the particular acoustic signature of a successful meal, conversation building and relaxing in the rhythm that meant people were comfortable, the pauses that meant food was being properly appreciated. Albert came to her at 9:30. "Julius Baron," Albert said, "has spoken more words to His Majesty this evening than in the previous 2 years of council meetings." "Good words or bad words?" she asked. Albert considered. "Words about grain storage in the Northern Territories," he said, "and river access during the freeze season, and a very specific complaint about road maintenance between the 3rd and 4th Northern waypoints that apparently represents 18 months of frustration he has never previously had occasion to articulate." "Also good," Joni said. "His Majesty listened to all of it," Albert said, and asked questions. She exhaled. "The council inquiry?" she asked. Albert's expression shifted into something that might, on a less composed face, have been satisfaction. "Julius Baron withdrew it this afternoon," he said, "before the dinner. His Majesty, following your counsel, met with him privately for 30 minutes first. The inquiry was withdrawn before the 1st course was served." Joni sat down on the kitchen stool. She hadn't known about the private meeting. Harold hadn't mentioned it this morning. He'd just done it, quietly and efficiently, in the way he did difficult things. She thought about that for a moment. About a man who had been managing 7 kingdoms alone for 11 years, absorbing every difficult thing himself without asking for help or counsel or even acknowledgement, and who had, in this instance, accepted both and used them. Who had sat at her small kitchen table and learned something. Albert cleared his throat gently. "Miss Frances," he said, "His Majesty has asked me to convey, and I am quoting him directly, as this is the first time in 9 years of service that he has asked me to convey anything personal, so I want to be precise." Albert straightened slightly. "Tell her the third course was exceptional, and that I'd like her to be there next time." Joni looked at him. "Next time," she said. "Those were his words," Albert said. "I believe he means the next dinner, though the there in question may have some ambiguity regarding location." She thought about the green dress, still in its box. She thought about what there might mean, coming from Harold Hess. "Tell him," she said carefully, "that I'll think about it." Albert permitted himself the smallest possible smile. "I'll tell him you said yes," he said. "It will save time." She opened her mouth, closed it. "That's not, Miss Frances," Albert said, with the gentle certainty of a man who had spent 9 years in close observation of his king, and the past 3 weeks in somewhat astonished observation of her. "In my experience, when you say you'll think about something, you have already decided. You simply need a moment to stop arguing with yourself about it." He left before she could respond. She sat alone in the private kitchen and looked at the hearth and the small table and the jar of dried herbs, and felt, moving through her like something warm and irrevocable, the full accumulated weight of everything that had become true in this room. She was not just cooking his meals. She had not been just cooking his meals for some time now. She let herself say it, finally, in the privacy of her own kitchen, with no audience and no need to manage anyone's perception of it. She had been feeding someone who had been hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food, and being fed in return, in ways she hadn't known she was missing until they arrived. And she was not going back to the main kitchen. And Julius Baron had withdrawn his inquiry. And next time, she was going to be there. She got up and started cleaning the kitchen. Halfway through, she stopped. Went to the cold store. Took out the ingredients for the fennel chicken. She made it at 10 o'clock at night with no one to eat it, just to have the smell of it in the kitchen. Because some things were worth doing for their own sake. Because intention was part of the recipe. Because she was Joni Frances, and she showed love the only way she'd ever known how, with her hands and a hearth and whatever time she had. The private kitchen smelled like fennel and warmth, and something she'd stopped pretending was nothing. At 10:30, the connecting door opened. Harold stood in the doorway. He looked at the pan. He looked at her. "You made it again," he said. "I was testing the timing," she said. "At 10:30 at night. The kitchen is quieter then." He came in, sat down at the small table. She served 2 plates, because of course she did. They ate the fennel chicken at 10:30 at night by the low fire, and nobody talked about Julius Baron, or council inquiries, or the green dress, or the word there, and what it meant. They talked about the road maintenance problem between the 3rd and 4th northern waypoints, because Harold had apparently found it genuinely interesting and wanted her perspective. She had thoughts. He listened to all of them. Outside, the palace settled into its nighttime quiet, and the hearth burned warm, and the jar of dried herbs sat in the center of the small table, and Joni Frances stopped arguing with herself about any of it. She had always been better at yes than no. For the first time in her life, she was entirely certain that was not a flaw. Chapter 10. 3 months after a junior kitchen maid left a bowl of slow-braised lamb stew on the Alpha King's private dining tray on a dare, the palace had developed what Albert Parks privately categorized as a new operational normal. The private kitchen was Joni's. Not officially. There had been no formal announcement, no document passed through the royal steward's office, no amendment to the palace staff registry that anyone had filed. It had simply become true the way certain things became true in institutions that ran on precedent and observation, gradually, then completely, then so thoroughly that the earlier arrangement was difficult to remember. Edmund had stopped reassigning her to the main kitchen rotation 4 weeks ago. Not because anyone told him to, but because Edmund was a man of exceptional professional instincts, and he understood, without being informed, that some situations had resolved into a new configuration, and fighting the configuration was less interesting than working within it. He sent her the best provisions from the market stores. She returned the favor by developing, with his input and over 3 increasingly satisfying afternoons, a revised stock technique that combined their respective approaches and was better than either of them had managed separately. Edmund had looked at the result and said, with the gravity of a man awarding a military honor, acceptable. She'd considered it the highest praise of her career. The council had stopped talking. Not because the subject had become less interesting. If anything, the subject had become significantly more interesting over 3 months, but because Julius Baron had become, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had finally been given what he actually wanted, one of Harold's most reliable council voices on Northern territorial matters. And Julius Baron talking against the Alpha King's personal arrangements was now Julius Baron talking against his own position at the table, which Julius Baron was not inclined to do. The other lords had read the geometry and adjusted accordingly. Nina Moyer had stopped issuing careful warnings and started, with equal care, issuing something that Joni gradually understood was cautious, qualified goodwill. The conversion had happened incrementally and without discussion, which she respected. Rebecca Cassidy had returned to the palace for a visit 6 weeks ago, and spent an afternoon in the private kitchen drinking tea and watching Joni work with an expression that moved, over the course of 2 hours, from careful assessment to something considerably warmer. "You're not what I expected," Rebecca had said, eventually. "What did you expect?" Joni had asked. "I don't know exactly. Someone, grander, perhaps, more architecturally suited to the position." "I clean floors," Joni said pleasantly. "Architecturally speaking." "You dismantled Julius Baron using dinner," Rebecca said. "In my experience, that's considerably more difficult than floors." She had gone back to her visiting with the air of someone who had confirmed something she'd half suspected, and found the confirmation satisfactory. The morning that everything changed was a Tuesday in late autumn, cold enough that the palace grounds had frosted overnight, and the private kitchen's hearth needed building up an hour earlier than usual. Joni arrived at 6 o'clock to find Harold already at the table. This was no longer unprecedented. It had become, over the past month, a pattern that neither of them had explicitly established, and both of them maintained without discussion. He arrived early and brought papers. She arrived and made coffee. They existed in the same space in the morning quiet before the palace came to life, and it was the part of the day she had stopped being able to imagine not having. This morning he was not reading papers. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking at the herb jar in the center of it, with an expression she didn't immediately recognize. She came in, closed the door, tied on her apron, looked at him. "What happened?" she said. He looked up. "Nothing bad," he said. "I want to say that first. Nothing is wrong." "All right," she said, going to the hearth to build up the fire, because her hands needed something to do, and fires didn't wait for conversations to conclude. "I've been thinking," he said. "You think constantly," she said. "You'll have to be more specific." "About the autumn court," he said. "The next one, in 6 months." She waited. "There is a tradition," he said, with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed an approach and was now finding the rehearsal inadequate, for the Alpha King to formally present, to formally introduce, to court, a chosen partner, at the autumn court opening. The fire caught. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. "I know the tradition," she said quietly. "I haven't participated in it," he said. "In 11 years, there have been council recommendations, suitable candidates by their measure. I've declined all of them." "I know that too," she said. A pause. "I want to participate," he said. "This year." She stood up, turned around. He was looking at her with the dark, steady eyes that had, over 3 months, become the most familiar and most significant landscape in her daily life. Not the Alpha King's eyes, or not only, Harold's eyes, the ones she'd learned from the inside out, that she could read the way she read a stock, by instinct and accumulated attention. They were nervous, she realized. Harold Hess, who had faced 11 years of territorial disputes and political crises, and the weight of 7 kingdoms without visible nerves, was sitting at her kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood and looking at her with something that was, unmistakably, the anxious quality of someone who cared very much about what happened next. "Joni," he said. "That's my name," she said, because she needed a second, and deflection was the tool available. "I want it to be you," he said, "at the autumn court opening, not because it's practical. It isn't particularly, by council standards. Not because it solves a political problem, Rebecca will tell you it creates several. But because—" He stopped, started again. "Every morning," he said, "I arrive here before you. I sit at this table, and I wait, and when you come in and tie on your apron and build up the fire, His jaw worked briefly. "I feel like a person. You said that was what you gave me, and you said it like it was a small thing. It isn't a small thing. It is the only thing I have wanted, consistently, for 11 years, that I did not know how to want without it feeling like weakness." The kitchen was completely quiet. Joni stood by the hearth she'd just built up and looked at the man at her table and felt the full, specific, unmanageable weight of the past 3 months settle into something solid and clear. "I cook your meals," she said. "That's still true." "Yes," he said. "I am still a farmer's daughter from the outer territories who got here on someone else's examination pass and has been peeling potatoes." "You have not peeled a potato in 3 months," he said. "That's not the point." "What is the point?" he said. "Tell me exactly, because I want to understand the specific barrier." She pressed her hands together. "I don't know how to be what that requires," she said honestly. "The autumn court presentation. What comes after it? I know this kitchen. I know this table. I know how to feed you and how to talk to you and how to— I know you, Harold. I know you in a way I didn't expect to know anyone. But the rest of it— I don't need you to know the rest of it immediately," he said. "I need you to be willing to learn it. There's a difference." She looked at him. "You said that to me," she said quietly. 3 months ago. About helping people versus being unable to decline." "I remember," he said. "One is a choice," she said. "The other is a habit." "Yes," he said. "So I'm asking you to make the choice. Not out of inability to decline. Not because you can't say no. You've learned to say no, these past months, to more things than I've counted. I've watched you do it and I've been proud of you for it, if that isn't strange to say." "It's a little strange to say," she said. "I know." The corner of his left eye creased. "I'm asking you to say yes because you want to, because you choose to. Not for me, and not because you can't say no, for yourself." Joni Francis stood in her kitchen in the early morning frostlight and looked at Harold Hess and performed, for perhaps the first time in her life, a completely uncomplicated internal calculation. Not what does he need. Not what will help. Not what will happen if I say no, or what's expected, or what's practical by council standards. Just, what do I want? The answer was so immediate, and so complete, and so thoroughly unsurprising, that she almost laughed. "You're going to have to warn Albert," she said. "He's going to need to reorganize the autumn court schedule." Harold was very still for a moment. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That's a yes," she said. "That's— yes, Harold. Obviously yes." He exhaled. Long and slow, the same sound as the night in the study, the release of something held too long. He stood up, crossed the kitchen in 2 steps. And for the second time, but the first time that was entirely chosen, entirely clear, entirely without the emergency of a settled wolf or a near breaking, he put his forehead against hers. Joni closed her eyes. "I'm still going to cook your meals," she said. "I know," he said. "Edmund is going to have opinions about the jurisdiction." "Edmund has opinions about everything," he said. "We'll manage him." "Julius Baron is going to— Julius Baron," he said quietly, "is going to be invited to the autumn court presentation and is going to attend because he now has a genuine investment in the stability of this administration, which I'm aware is entirely your doing." She smiled. Felt him register it somehow, the way he registered most things, completely, without missing it. "The coffee is getting cold," she said. "I know," he said. Neither of them moved for another moment. The hearth she'd built burned warm and steady behind her. The frost light came through the small high window in the particular pale gold of early autumn mornings. The herb jar sat in the center of the small table, where it had sat for 3 months, accumulating the weight of every evening, and every morning, and every meal made with intention for someone who had been hungry for a very long time. Finally Harold stepped back, just far enough to look at her properly. 6 months, he said, to the autumn court opening. 6 months, she agreed. Albert will want to begin preparations immediately. Albert has probably already begun, she said. Probably, he conceded. She turned back to the hearth and picked up the coffee pot, poured 2 cups, set his in front of his chair, and sat down across from him with hers, in the seat that had become, over 3 months of 6 o'clock mornings and 7 o'clock evenings, simply where she sat. He sat down, picked up his cup, looked at her over it with the eyes she knew now, the full and specific landscape of them. "Breakfast," he said. "Breakfast," she agreed. She got up and started it. Epilogue. 1 year later. The private kitchen had a second herb jar now. Joni hadn't planned it. She'd simply come in one morning to find that Harold had placed one on the windowsill, presumably because he'd decided the single jar on the table was insufficiently represented, and the kitchen would benefit from a second. He hadn't mentioned it. She hadn't asked. It was simply there, with the quiet certainty of something he'd decided and acted on, which she was learning was simply how he moved through decisions he was confident about. She was learning a great many things. The year since the autumn court opening, since she had stood in the great hall in a dress that was not green this time but deep amber, which Harold had selected and Albert had delivered and she had worn with considerably more composure than the first time, had been the most instructive of her life. She had learned, for instance, that diplomacy was not as foreign to her as she'd believed, that her particular skill, understanding what people were actually hungry for beneath what they said they wanted, translated across contexts with surprising consistency. That Harold had been right. She didn't need to know everything immediately. She needed to be willing to learn it. The learning, it turned out, was the part she was best at. She had learned that Rebecca Cassidy was, underneath the careful assessment and the political clarity, someone she trusted. That Nina Moyer was someone she could work with and eventually, cautiously, call a colleague. That Albert Parks expressed warmth exclusively through logistical efficiency, which once you understood it was actually quite legible and often touching. She had learned that Edmund, presented with a queen who wanted to continue working in the private kitchen, had responded with the same ominous silence he brought to all significant events, and then sent her, the following morning, his mother's recipe for a northern winter stew, handwritten on paper that had clearly been stored for a long time, with no note attached. She had kept it. She had made the stew that evening, and Harold had eaten 2 bowls. She had not told Edmund this, but suspected he knew. The morning in question, 1 year and 3 months after a dare and a bowl of lamb stew, and the most consequential yes of her life, began the same way most mornings began. Harold was at the table when she arrived. Papers, coffee attempted by himself with improving results, the particular quality of stillness that meant he'd been there a while and was content to be there. She came in, tied on her apron, built up the fire, poured herself coffee from his pot, because it was easier than making a second one, sat down. He looked up from his papers. Something in his expression did the thing, the specific, particular thing she still looked for without meaning to, the thing that lived to the left of a smile, but was increasingly willing to become one outright. "Edmund sent a note," he said. "About?" "He wants to discuss the midwinter feast menu. Specifically, he wants your input on the 3rd course before he finalizes it." A pause. He used the phrase, "Her instinct on the northern preparations is more reliable than my own," which I'm told is Edmund's equivalent of a formal endorsement. Joni stared at him. "He said that?" "Albert has it in writing," Harold said. "I thought you'd want documentation." She sat back in her chair. Outside the small high window, the first snow of the season was beginning. Light, tentative, The exploratory kind that wasn't committing to anything yet. The hearth was going well. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the remnants of last night's supper and the dried herbs from both jars. "Harold," she said. "Yes. Do you remember what you said to me, that first day, in the dining hall?" He considered. "I said the stock held," he said. "You said it was the best thing you'd eaten in 4 years," she said. "Yes," he said. "That. Was that true?" she asked, not doubting it. She'd never doubted it. Just wanting to hear it said again, in this kitchen, 1 year later, with the snow outside and the fire behind her. Harold Hess set down his papers and looked at her with the full, unperformed, complete attention that was simply how he loved things, without announcement, without performance, with a totality that she had learned over a year was both his primary characteristic and his most significant gift. "Yes," he said. "It was true." A pause. "The lamb stew, specifically, though everything since has been considerably better." "The stock needed another hour," she said. "The stock," he said, "was perfect." She smiled. He looked at her smiling, and the corner of his left eye did the thing, and then, because it was 1 year later and he had learned certain things too, stopped doing the thing and became the smile itself. She got up and started breakfast. He went back to his papers. Outside, the snow committed. The second herb jar on the windowsill caught the pale winter light, and the hearth burned warm, and the small kitchen table held 2 cups and a jar, and the particular weight of everything that had happened in it, and Joni Francis, who had never been able to say no, who had cooked for a king on a dare, who had learned that some yeses were not habits but choices, and that choices made with intention were the most reliable recipe she'd ever found, made breakfast for 2. As she did every morning. As she would tomorrow. As she intended to, she thought, for considerably longer than that.